computer. Oh my God, Houston, there are two Jonahs.
There are two Jonahs.
There are two Jonahs. Is there a reason for there to be two
Congratulations on duplicating
Jonahs?
yourself.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Is there a reason for there to be two Jonahs? Of course not, right? Because let's be clear, one Jonah is plenty enough Jonahs. But having two Jonahs truly excites me beyond belief. I'm very excited. Yeah. Houston, how are you?
I'm good. I'm chilling.
You're chilling. Houston, we both just got back to school. You're doing your school stuff. I'm doing my school stuff.
Yeah.
How was your first day and a half of classes?
It was good. I only have 2 classes on Monday. Well, I have a tiny schedule, so I only have 2 classes Monday and then a class on Thursday and Friday. And so it's just kind of like been easing into it. Don't have much work at the start, but I'm sure it'll get busier later. Oh, I'm working on applying to graduate because nothing can be easy, and so you have to like send in an application and they have to be like, yeah, you're on track to graduate, or like, hey buddy, you're like not on track to graduate. And so I got the hey buddy, you're not on track to graduate email, and so I have to send a ton of emails and talk to a bunch of people, and no one understands what's going on, and it's so much fun. So
doesn't sound fun. Sorry.
No, it's not fun at all. But
yeah,
I think I have faith that it'll get cleared up and I'll be able to graduate in May.
All right. That's good. That's good.
That's what I've been working on.
Yeah. I think I'm going to graduate in the fall, probably. Yeah, I'm also a senior and I also should be graduating now. But my argument is that I was an architecture student my freshman year, and therefore none of my classes counted for like anything that I'm doing now. Gotcha. So I have, an architecture minor that's all done. And I am finishing off my cybersecurity minor this semester, and I'm going to finish off my major next semester.
In what? What's your major in?
Ethics, history, and public policy. Yeah. Okay. It's a ridiculous major that doesn't deserve to exist, but it exists, and therefore I'm taking it. Houston, I have a question.
Okay. I'll try and answer it.
Here's my question.
Okay.
When you talk to someone who you vehemently disagree with.
Yeah.
We were discussing this on Facebook earlier. What should the goal be?
Okay. So I have 2 responses, I think. I think in a forum where you're talking online and other people can either watch or like read or listen or whatever, I think it might be best to try and get like talk them off the ledge, but also B, talk all of the other thems off the ledge. Because I think getting them to kind of like reassess what they think and look at facts and look at whatever, if they have the possibility to. And I think that's the other thing. You have to decide, is it worth it? Is it worth getting upset over this person? And do you think they have the capacity to change? And if the answer is yes, then I think your goal should be to kind of like get them off the ledge. And then I think the second answer is that I think the goal should be to make them think. Whether that be like if you're in a forum or you're just kind of talking one-on-one, why do you hold these beliefs? Like what makes you think the way you do? And I think that's a good way to have a conversation, because I think in turn you kind of think about, why do I think these things, and where did my ideas come from?
The them there that you're talking about, the them, is the them this person you're speaking to who has these beliefs, or is the them the sort of assumed audience there?
I think, I mean, it's tricky because I feel like in either case you kind of have, if you're talking in an online space, if it's not texting, it's kind of an assumed audience. And so I think in general, you kind of have to take into consideration the audience. But I think if it's just like a one-on-one conversation you're having like in person or via text or phone call or whatever, I think focusing on them and trying to help them is better than
Yeah, that's interesting. So the reason that I brought this up was I was watching this first of all, we are, of course, ourselves, the two of us sat down for like, you were there for 7 hours. I was there for 8 hours with Daily Blend. And obviously Daily Blend is a complicated guy. I think that, there's certain ways that he's pretty far left. He was arguing on beside you in addition to you, against me in terms of minimum wage, which was fun. And then there were other parts that he was pretty sort of crazy far right in my view. So
Sure.
he was calling into question whether or not, Trump was secretly the one who won the election, which obviously he was not. We're talking about 2020 here, not 2016.
Right.
And so that was it's difficult there because on the one hand, like my sort of knee-jerk reaction when I hear people who I disagree with strongly is to be like somewhat combative, somewhat of a dick, right? Like not like, I'm not saying like dickish, like I don't think there's any like beef between us and Daily Blend. I think certainly after those again 8 hours long conversation, I don't think that he had any real like problem with us. But I also think that there were points in that conversation that were less perhaps like about convincing him and more about sort of expressing my frustration.
Right.
At least on my end. I think you did a better job than I did on that. But like my frustration with what views he held.
Right. And I think it's a difficult conversation. I think going into the future, it's going to be very difficult to talk to people about politics because you have different people coming at it at different angles. We've been over this on the channel. I don't know if this video has been up yet, but we don't really teach politics in school. And so you kind of get your first experience if you didn't take it in class at school. Your first experience is kind of like real world experience or experience from the news or experience from your family. And of course, I mean, like any of that information is going to be biased. But I think seeking out your own knowledge in this area, I don't think is the best. And so my point is being that if you're trying to make an argument and you don't completely understand how the system works or how government functions, it's going to be very difficult to argue with someone about that because they just don't understand.
Right. Yeah, that's a fair point.
There's going to be more and more people like that in the future because obviously it's become like a really big phenomenon. And I mean, necessarily so. I think if anything is going to be interesting to people, it should be politics because it's what controls their lives. But I think there's going to be a lot of uninformed people. So we have to figure out how to teach them.
Yeah. So that's an interesting point. So like when we're talking about uninformed people, there's a lot of uninformed people on both sides.
Right.
Like I think I don't want to like equate the degree of uninformed, right? Like I think that that AOC is uninformed in terms of her belief in the Green New Deal compared to a carbon dividend. That's uninformed in as much as like, I don't think she fully understands the problem of climate change as being an international issue in the way that someone like a Janet Yellen does. However, I'm not comparing that degree of being uninformed to the degree of being uninformed that like Marjorie Taylor Greene has of thinking that me as a Jew, obviously I have like these space lasers, whatever the fuck it was that she was talking about a couple days ago. And that therefore, oh, you didn't see this? Yeah, this is a sitting congresswoman. She thinks that the Jews have space lasers, which I want to be clear. Like, I want to have a space laser, but I don't have one yet. Okay. And it's important to recognize that when we're talking about the international cabal, we have to be honest about what the cabal does and doesn't have. No, but I'm like joking aside, there's a lot of people who are uninformed, even on our side.
Right.
On the Democratic side.
I think on Twitter a few days ago, like hashtag Biden lied was trending. And people were like, oh, well, he said he was going to pass $2,000 stimulus check and he hasn't done that yet. And I'm like,
therefore he's lying.
Yeah. And I'm
it's just like, I'm sorry, but
that's not how
anything
works.
Just because you're president is not dictator. You don't just get to do whatever you want as soon as you become president. That's not how it works.
And
but people don't realize that. Yeah.
You can't pass, like the president doesn't have the authority to pass bills regarding like spending, like money.
Right.
Like you just can't do that. And so I think people rightly, I checked later and there was a bunch of pictures of cat memes and stuff. But like for real, like people I knew were like retweeting stuff about like, oh, how Biden lied. And it's like, no.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. So I think that my concern is that like when we focus in the way that I certainly fall into the trappings of at like destroying the right,
Sure.
right? Like trying to beat them in the free marketplace of ideas.
Right.
I worry that that presumes that people already going into the conversation have a side, and that when people are going into the conversation with a side, if you're talking to someone who has a position on whether or not, even if it's not like a strongly held position, like knows the facts of the case, that there are, that, you know, is aware of like the positions that are talked about in the media at the very least, not the facts of the case, but like knows what people think.
Okay.
If you're going into conversation like that, being pretty rude, I think makes sense, because it is important to recognize that there is a huge distinction between disagreeing about healthcare, which we can still agree on the facts, we're just talking about morality, versus disagreeing on facts of who fucking won the presidency, which is just a fact. We have the data, we know the number of votes. We know that one has 7 million more votes than the other. We know the electoral college vote. We know that one has like, what is it, 72 more than the other, right? It wasn't a close election. It just wasn't. But if you assume that people know that, if you assume people know like that basic sort of knowledge is understood, going into the conversation being aggressive makes sense. But if they don't know that, if the audience can't be assumed to know that kind of stuff, it almost makes sense to just talk to your own side, even though you're talking literally to a person who's on the opposite side.
Why would you talk to your own side?
You talk to your own side because putting yourself in the place where you're talking to, particularly if it's a famous person or a person with an audience, but even just someone in general who's on the right wing, it's almost, this sounds kind of rude, but it's almost like a walking straw man for you to be able to make your claim against, right? So you're looking. So the example another example that I was thinking of before we had this conversation was there's this Guardian interview with Richard Spencer. It's this black man. He's from Britain, born and raised in Britain. You know, clearly feels some sense of British pride, talking about like the history of Britain and the history of the United States with Richard Spencer, who for context is a white supremacist, loud and proud, you know, neo-Nazi. He's been Hail Hitlered, you know, multiple times, and encourages his audience to do so. So like, in that context, there's sort of two options. You can say, okay, right now in the United States of America, there are whatever it is, 50,000 people who are genuinely white supremacists in the context of Richard Spencer, in the context that they're literally Sieg Heiling, they're literally, you know, screaming that Jews will not replace us, they're literally marching and encouraging the lynching of black people. That kind of racist. But there's also like 70 million people in this country who are racist in the abstract.
Yeah.
And so my question is like, when you're talking to Richard Spencer, you can either talk to the Richard Spencer types, you can talk in a way that will be understood and heard by them to pull them to become one of the 70 million who aren't literally attempting to lynch black people.
Right.
Or you can talk to the 70 million and convince the 70 million that these white supremacists are fucking disgusting. And because they're one of the good ones, right? They're not that bad, right?
Right.
Maybe they'll be convinced, hopefully, not to be one of those 70 million and instead become one of the people who's trying more actively to benefit black people and benefit.
Yeah, I think the issue is that the 70 million don't consider themselves to be racist in any form. And so it'll just go over their heads. Like they just won't understand that like the person is talking to them because they're racist in the abstract, right? They're not literally racist, and so they're like, oh, I'm okay, you know? And so they just won't think about it.
Interesting. I have a question.
Okay.
What's your thought process about sit-ins?
Sit-ins?
Yeah, when black people would protest by sitting in at a restaurant during the civil rights movement.
What do you mean? What's my thought process? Like, why?
Do you think
why
that
do
was
we
a good
do it?
idea? Do you think that's a beneficial tactic that helped the overall movement?
Honestly, I don't know much about the context that they have. I mean, like, so I know that they happened during the civil rights movement. And I know, I think the main thing was that you get a lot of attention,
Mm-hmm.
because you're just kind of, you're sitting, like the famous pictures of like the men sitting at the bar, um, and you get the people that are like running, like throwing stuff at them and trying to pull them off the chairs. And it just gets people involved and it gets on the news and gets people talking about this issue. And so I think from that perspective, it's helpful and important for, uh, just like a big show of, revolt against the mainstream to get people interested.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But presumably you're not going to be able to convince the white supremacists at those actual restaurants who are literally, pouring milkshakes and sometimes
Right.
trying to choke, right? People weren't supposed to wear, jewelry of any kind, like earrings. Women were told explicitly don't wear earrings because they will be ripped literally out of your ear and literally
Right.
your earlobe will like break off, right? Men were told not to wear ties, or if they did, to have clip-ons because they would literally be choked to death or hung.
Right.
So like, you're obviously not convincing the white people who are literally in that room.
Right.
And you're not even convincing white people who are marginally in the same headspace as
Yeah.
those white people. But you're pointing out something that I think is quite interesting, which is to say that the sort of aggregate whites, the
Mhm.
whites who are don't consider themselves to be racist, but are racist in as much as they don't necessarily want to have a black person be at the restaurant next to them.
Right.
It forces them to think through like, well, I definitely wouldn't literally choke a black person for being in the same restaurant as me. Am I okay with the fact that there are other whites who are doing that? And it forces the broader problem, which isn't just those individuals, but the broader sort of ethos by which those individuals are allowed to go about doing what they do.
Mhm.
I'm curious if you think that like talking to a Richard Spencer type, talking to the most extreme version of the problem today might still be beneficial.
I don't know. Honestly, I'm not sure. I feel like it would be better to talk to the people who are racist in the abstract or are on the fence.
Mm.
Um, just because I think the other issue is that they just don't think about it because they're not, maybe they don't know any people minority, or they're not close friends with anyone, or they're like living in the same like homogenous town or whatever. Um, and if you don't have to think about it, or if you don't grow up learning about it, I just don't think you, not that you don't care, but like you don't care. Right? Because like you
Right,
don't have a
right.
reason to. You're like, okay, like racism, I know it's a thing, I learned about it in school, and we did this, that, and the other thing, and that's what happened. And so you're kind of like going about your day. But if you're forced to kind of like think about why you have these preconceived notions or why you think these things, um, then I think you're more likely to change. Like if you don't have like the vitriol and hatred, and you're just kind of like indifferent, um, I think those people are better to talk to just because they have the ability to change. And then the other thing is they have the ability to talk to their like other people around them who might also think the same way. Um, if you're in a family and you have an argument over Thanksgiving about like some like policy that just happened, you're more likely to say, "Hey, wait a minute, like don't say that," or "You can't like don't say that about these people," or like, you know,
Hmm.
because you've kind of like had to think of, because you've been forced to think about it. I think most people just don't think about it. Um, I mean, because
Interesting.
like,
Yeah.
granted, it's not a fun thing to think about, but uh, it's just not something they do.
Hmm. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
I've got another question.
Okay.
Okay. Ben Shapiro famously has no left-wing friends.
Okay.
Explicitly, he says that anytime you're talking to a liberal or a leftist,
Okay.
the only goal should be to change their mind. And if you don't think that's possible, to obliterate them in the free marketplace of ideas, to make fun of them, and to ensure that everyone listening recognizes how fucking stupid they are.
Okay.
I'm like using somewhat more flowery language than he
Sure.
would, but like
But
that's
I
basically
understand the
that is
concept.
basically what he says.
Okay.
Should I have Republican friends?
To do the same thing, or
No. Should I avoid becoming attached to Republicans? Should I ensure that like my ethos, my social structure, like all of my close friends, people who like I genuinely care about, if they are Republican, I should either excise them from the community, or
okay.
I should spend every waking moment that I'm with them trying to convince them to depart from their ways.
I'd say neither. I think the best thing to do would to I mean, it's interesting because I think in this day and age it's a lot more complicated, just because everything is so partisan and everything is so like so very political. um and so I think it'll be hard to have conversations about anything else. But I think the main thing that I try and do anyway is to be respectful. I think you can have a conversation about something, and I think be open. And I think if the person you're talking to sees that you're open for change of idea or thought, then they're open to for change in idea and thought. And you don't. It doesn't sound bad. You don't necessarily even have to be open. Just like assume, like
Just pretend.
Just pretend.
Pretend.
Yeah. Pretend like, oh, that's like if they're telling you about some conspiracy, like, oh, really? That's interesting. I didn't know about that. Like, can you tell me more? Like, I want to hear about this. And they're like, oh, yeah, sure. And then when it's your turn to talk, oh, like, look at like this thing.
The
You're like,
devil
oh,
comes
really?
out.
Yeah. And you don't even have to like be that interested in what they're saying, but just be like,
right.
Look, like I see you as a person and I respect your ideas as a person. And so like cool, like that's what you think, that's so cool, like that's interesting, like I'll take that and I'll go do more research if you really care. But also like, hey, like this is where I'm coming from, and they might be like, oh really, that's interesting, or they might be like, ew, like that's awful.
Ew, disgusting.
But like,
yeah,
that also opens the door for further conversation. Because I think if you have friends with opposite beliefs, and you keep talking to them, not even like, hey, like I'm going to talk to you every day about this, but like you just have conversations and you can have like a dialogue about an issue. I think it'll be helpful for opening them up in the future to new ideas and new opinions and stuff. Yeah, so I'd say keep them.
So keep them around.
Right.
But slowly kind of try to trickle in some indoctrination.
Right, yeah.
Politely.
Yeah.
Trickle in the indoctrination.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you feel about people who are just wrong?
Yeah, I don't
like. I should clarify.
think...
Wrong in terms of like facts, not wrong
right.
in terms of like I disagree with them, but like wrong as in I believe that Trump is actually the president right now.
Right.
Like just incorrect.
Yeah, I really don't know if there's anything you can do about that. Just because like they're just dumb, you know? Like if you're not smart enough to understand, if you're not smart enough to understand facts, and you believe that there are other facts, or like your belief is as valid as someone else's fact, then like that's just dangerous. Because it's also dangerous to listen. I think at that point it's dangerous to listen to them because that only feeds their ego and that only feeds their belief. But at the same time, I think it's dangerous to not hear them, because it's also like feeding, oh, you just have a different belief, or you're just different. And so you can't even have a conversation with me, and so like that's bad. So yeah, I don't really know. I think in a large scale, if I could, would the best thing to be would separate them. Just like
excise them from community.
Right. Like, because I think if
I like the word excise, it's a good word.
I think if people on a large scale do that, like if I was listening to a podcast the other day, and this woman called it, or this man called in, and his wife was friends with a bunch of like super Trumpies, and like hated, like who hate Biden, like, or like they're all in the conspiracy theories against COVID or whatever, and she's like still becoming friends with them and talking to them about this stuff, and he's like, I literally can't, like like it's driving me crazy. And it's like, what do you do in that situation? Because the wife refused to stop hanging out with her friends, and he was like, look, like if you can't stop, like we have to there's distance have to be involved. Like we either have to break up, or we have to, like, we can't be in the same room together. We have to work out a living situation, because like you could kill me. And I think that's also dangerous. So yeah, I guess just max excisation, if that's
interesting
the plural.
Excisation,
because then I think if you're alone, like that, I think that's the only point when you question yourself. If everyone you talk to leaves you, like
yeah,
then I think you'll start to question your beliefs, because I think that's kind of dramatic. But
so I kind of have the opposite approach.
You have the opposite approach?
Yeah. So I mean, Daily Blend at one point started to talk about some conspiracy shit. This was in like hour 7 or 8. Were you still there at that point?
I think so.
Okay, you were still there. Yeah. So at that point, what I did was say, I also love conspiracies. Right. And I started talking about conspiracies about like JFK, stuff about like Jeffrey Epstein, stuff about like, you know, these things that are, number one, grounded in reality, and number two, don't encourage people to go kill the Jews.
Right.
Then he started talking as a general rule.
Right.
Yeah. Then he started talking about like the coronavirus shit. And because I was already in the vein of making fun of like just joking around about conspiracies, right? In a sort of nonchalant, obviously most of what we're saying here is definitely not true.
Right.
I feel like I did a pretty good, there were certainly definitely other parts of the conversation that I think I did poorly in. But I think that one of the good things in that conversation was when we were able to say, like, yeah, that one's a little too far. That was a little out there, a little silly. And there was space for him to be able to say like, yeah, that's true. And sort of like come back into the ethos of like normalcy. Whereas I worry that under the approach that you're proposing of like excising people, there's no real space for the return to normalcy. I'm very big on like, how do we make space for people to come back into the fold of normalcy while not making space for the ideas that they used to hold? Gotcha. And I think one of the better ways to do that is to allow them to pretend that they never actually held the views that they did.
Huh. But then what about...
Like here's an equivalent.
I guess if they're not like hurting anyone, because like I feel like the issue with that is like they did hold those beliefs and they could be potentially dangerous to lots of different people, and so I think that there has to be some kind of way to be like, hey, like that was bad, like
for sure.
Right.
So here's the equivalent that I'll the parallel that I'll suggest.
Okay.
In comedy, stealing a joke is like a serious crime.
Okay.
Right? Like a serious problem. You're not allowed to steal jokes. People will excommunicate you, right? It's not okay. You are absolutely not allowed to steal jokes.
Okay.
However, there are good comedians that have stolen jokes and are still very funny and are still otherwise like very talented comedians, but they did steal a joke this one time. In the comedy world, the way that is often resolved is there's this idea of like, this sort of amnesia of like, you forgot while riffing on stage that actually this was a joke that belonged to someone else. And so by allowing that to be the thing that you say, even if it's not true, even if it genuinely was stolen in malice, by saying that that's the case, you're able to save face as the person who stole the joke, because they're able to say, oh, it was genuinely an accident. I'm so sorry. It won't happen again. I wasn't attempting to do that. And you don't look like a bad person.
Yeah.
The person whose joke it was, who actually wrote the joke, gets to maintain their control and ownership of that joke, and like maintains, and like no one is going to sort of question whether or not it's their joke, whether or not it's like them who deserves it.
Right.
And so you're ceding like obviously, yes, that's your joke. I'm not trying to like steal it from you or anything like that. And also there's still space for everyone to move back into like normal comedy circuit and not have beef with every other comedian in the world because they're a joke thief. And I think that's like a very beneficial sort of, even if it's a lie, it's a beneficial lie that allows comedy writ large to work out better.
Interesting. So you're suggesting that we allow them
to pretend that QAnon was a joke.
Right.
Tell me that QAnon was a joke, and I'll pretend to believe you.
Interesting.
And we'll move on with our lives.
Interesting. Huh. I feel like that could work, actually.
Right. So that's my thinking. My thinking is that
I think it could work.
So my thinking,
but how do you get them to believe that QAnon was a joke?
So obviously I'm a little spicy. So my answer is going to be a little spicy.
Right.
My spicy response is out crazy the crazy. They think that the Jews have lasers. No, we don't just have lasers. We actually control Mars. There's actually a city with 1 million Jews living on Mars. Mars is just a second Israel. Right? Like, I don't know.
But what does that do?
What that does is it puts that whole world into the context of things that are so obviously ridiculous that it makes space for people to pretend that all of it was a joke from the get-go, post-mortem.
Okay. Interesting. So,
You seem to doubt it.
I don't know. I just think if people are willing to believe the crazy in the first place, like, why won't they just believe the super crazy?
I think that there's a line. There's got to be some line where people stop believing the crazy.
I feel like we've been down this road before. There's always a line. I honestly don't think there's a line. The older I get, the more I think I realize that there isn't a line.
That's very scary. Yeah.
Because just like every single time, it's like, for whether it be the Trump stuff or the Congress stuff or the COVID stuff, like there's a line that sane people, just sane, like good people won't cross, but
then
they always cross it.
Then they cross it. Yeah.
Right. And so like, sure, maybe for this time they won't believe that Mars has like second Israel with the space lasers.
Jews, yeah.
But like in 10 years or in 5 years, maybe there'll be like some kind of new conspiracy or a new story that puts that in a different light. That's like, maybe they do.
What if we make all of our conspiracies about old people who are dead? What if I make all of my conspiracies about Jeffrey Epstein and about John F. Kennedy and about how Ronald Reagan was, secretly a flying saucer and all of that shit? Because they're dead.
Right.
The assumption that because they're dead, no one's going to create anything dangerous about them.
That's true.
Because they're already dead. Like what
Right.
what exactly could you do that would like screw society because you believe crazy things about
Dead people,
King Tut or
yeah.
Alexander the Great?
That maybe could work.
Like, what if I just go around saying that Alexander the Great was actually the bastard son of Cleopatra? Like, you know, like who does that hurt? Is it wrong? Of course it's wrong. But who does it hurt?
But that's also
that
like
I'm
you're
saying
putting more false information out there.
But like, okay, so you might have a different view on this. I don't care that there's wrong ideas out there. I care about like.
But that's what we're talking about, though.
No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm worried about like the stuff that's downstream from it. I'm worried about because if you don't believe in the truth that like Trump lost, like if I genuinely believe that the election was stolen,
okay,
if I genuinely believe that, I might very well invade the Capitol.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
I mean, like
yeah,
that makes perfect sense.
Right.
If you believe that the country was stolen and that by going in to have a conversation or threaten Mike Pence, I can save America.
Yeah.
Hell yeah.
Right.
Sure. Right? Makes perfect sense. It's just that it was founded on a lie.
Yeah.
So that's a lie that's dangerous. But like when people get super mad about like flat Earth, like why? Why do you care that people think that the Earth is flat? It's not. Sure, they're wrong. But who cares that they're wrong?
It's kind of like if you can believe in the flat Earth theory, like what else? It's like a bag of worms to other stuff.
Yeah, but there's like billion Christ culters who genuinely believe that what's his face walked on water.
That's true.
Who gives a shit?
Yeah.
There's all these people.
But I don't know. I just feel like critical thinking is an important skill, and just giving more false information for people to fail at the critical thinking test is like not ideal.
Do you think it's a universal skill? Like, do you think that it's a skill that your ability to critically think about politics will aid in your ability to critically think about like where and when should I be walking around on this given street? Like street skills are a skill set.
Yeah, they're different.
And they're clearly a real skill set that really does matter.
Right.
But like, does that skill set and your ability to understand like what's going on between people in that sense affect your ability to understand what's going on in between people in the context of the stock market?
No, doesn't.
So that's my thinking. Like, I'm not sure that people thinking crazy shit about Alexander Hamilton, like that he's white or some shit, something crazy like that. To clarify, he unironically isn't white. But like real Alexander Hamilton, not just Lin-Manuel Miranda. But like the rest of them were all white, obviously.
Right.
But the point is that like, should the fact that people think crazy things like that matter?
I guess not. I guess it just doesn't though, because people think crazy shit all the time. So I guess it doesn't matter. So long as they don't believe
the dangerous
the
crazy
important
shit.
Crazy. Yeah.
The dangerous crazy shit.
Yeah.
So okay, how do we divide what the
we have
crazy
to
shit that's
divide.
okay and the crazy shit that's not okay? That's dangerous crazy shit.
Yeah.
How do we figure out which one's which?
The bullshit detector.
The bullshit detector.
We need like a living bullshit detector.
A living bullshit detector. See, that's very
Or
interesting.
like, maybe do we teach bullshit in class, like in school? Do we have like a like?
Are you asking like how to detect bullshit, or are you saying do we teach it? Because we definitely do teach bullshit in class.
Oh no, we do. But I mean like this stuff is like common bullshit that like people believe, you know?
Well, but so here's the thing. Like, okay, so here's a hot take. I like some bullshit.
Sure, some bullshit
is
good.
helpful.
Right.
This
But I think
bullshit
being
of
able
like,
to distinguish between the like helpful bullshit and the not helpful bullshit, that might be a skill that can be taught.
but like my point is that like there are some lies that I actively believe society is better off if people believe them. So like here's a lie
Okay.
that Mahatma Gandhi succeeded. That Mahatma Gandhi was anything other than a market failure
Okay.
in every dimension. After his whole nonviolent bullshit in India, Pakistan,
Yeah.
when the British left, literally millions of people were killed in this racist coup where one country split in the middle and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of migrants were forced into either side of the aisle because of a gigantic division on religious lines.
I didn't know that.
Total failure, right? Absolute failure. However, the myth of Mahatma Gandhi, where he was successful, continues to this day to benefit us in the international community, in that we look back at him pretending that he was successful as an argument on behalf of nonviolence and on behalf of this sort of fluffy feeling of goodness and compassion and working together. We have this lie that Mother Teresa, was this perfect person in every sense, but she was like very, very anti-abortion, and she was, there were some problems with her, right?
Sure.
We have this lie where Martin Luther King was this fluffy guy who just like, had this dream and everyone was like, yeah, cool, chill, right? We pretend that Rosa Parks just decided to sit down and on this bus one time, and then they were like, hey, get up, and she was like, nah, but why? And then after that, everyone's like, yeah, chill, right? And like maybe those are harmful lies, but I think that they also do some pretty damn important work.
Yeah. But then you also get into the argument where people don't know the truth, and it's like I think there's more important like things behind the, like we were talking about earlier with the sit-ins. If more people were able to grapple with the reason why Rosa Parks sat and the history behind it and what that did for the civil rights movement as a whole, like I think people would be more willing to get behind Black Lives Matter. People would be more willing to understand that the country hasn't really changed that much in terms of racism. It's just, sure, it's gotten more laws to protect Black people and maybe changed the way that people think about Black people, where like the progressive whites have gotten more progressive, which is good, and the I forget what we call them, the racist in theory people are just kind of like,
we call them conservatives.
Also,
we call them conservatives sometimes. We want to be
spicy.
Mad. Yeah, we want to be spicy.
But they're just kind of like,
don't mind me, I'm just getting some chalky milk.
So it's like, I think if we can teach, I think the lie is important to uphold the good things that those people did. However, I think if we were more aware of the whole truth, it would lead to a better educated society and a better like informed society about, I guess, in these situations, race issues specifically. Because I think like more information about race issues is important, because like I'd like to be okay, Yeah. So I don't know like where this line is.
I don't know either. I genuinely don't know either.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult thing to figure out.
Yeah.
And I worry that like I definitely in the past, perhaps even now, have a tendency to focus too much on like arguing in a way that actually makes sense in the minds of the conservatives that are there.
Mhm.
the person that I'm actually arguing with, arguing in a way that I think I can potentially convince them.
Yeah.
But maybe that's wrong.
Yeah.
It's weird.
I think you should work to convince the masses.
I should convince the masses.
Because I think the other thing is like those, it's kind of like a pyramid where those, we were talking about the people, those 50,000 people or whatever sit on top of the 50 million that are kind of racist in theory. And I think if you start to eat away at the racist in theory pile, then the people who are legitimately racist have less legs to stand on.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. Is that us acting in bad faith?
What do you mean?
Is it acting in bad faith to approach a far, far, far right person with the goal of using them to convince people who aren't them, but not speaking to them in a way that you think that is actually productively gives a possibility of trying to convince them?
I guess it would be, but I don't think it matters.
So what you're telling me, Houston, is you're a bad faith actor.
Yeah.
You don't actually care about America. You're a disgusting, disgusting man who hates society writ large and doesn't even care about the future. That's what you're telling me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're saying, like, is bad faith bad? Should we be bad faith? What does it mean to be a bad faith actor?
I mean, I don't actually know. I just know in theory about like doing something with the wrong intention. But I don't know. I think good and bad are very like not black and white. And I think that there are some things that society has deemed bad that aren't actually bad. And some things that like we can like move on from, you know.
Interesting. What are some examples of things that we think are bad but aren't actually bad?
I mean, for hundreds of thousands of years, the gay thing was like, that's bad. And now, more recently, we're like, no, that's not that bad. But it's like, I think for me, once you're willing to kind of like go against the norm in one or multiple ways, you just kind of start thinking about the other ways in which it's kind of like, why do we do that? I think this is potentially one of them. I don't know, like, is it bad to talk to someone trying to convince other people? I don't think so. I mean, I think you're doing them a disservice maybe because you're not directly addressing them.
Right.
Or maybe you're not like arguing, like you're not having a conversation with them. You're trying to maybe touch on other points or whatever, but
like you're not really. See, here's another way of framing it. If you're talking to Daily Blend, but you're also talking to the 8 people who are watching, and that's a very small example, right? That's a pretty small audience compared to some of the audiences. If you're talking with Tucker Carlson,
right,
in front of his audience of millions,
right,
the percentage of your obligation thereof that goes to Tucker Carlson, that goes to the person that you're literally speaking to, is a very small fraction of the overall obligation you have to the audience writ large, to all of the people who are hearing you.
Yeah.
So the case could be made that like maybe it's bad faith to talk to Tucker Carlson and genuinely be talking to Tucker Carlson rather than focusing your message to the audience in general. So a good example of this is like Jordan Peterson. I think is a complicated man. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he's a
vaguely.
Yeah, so he was a professor, University of Toronto, I want to say, in Canada, for a while, and then he got in trouble because there was a new C16, something like that. There was some new law in Canada that he misinterpreted, I think, ultimately, because this hasn't actually happened yet. But he misinterpreted it as if you are a professor, you will go to jail for failing to use correct pronouns for someone who's going through transition as a professor. And he thought that was, really awful. And therefore he said, like, no, I'm not going to do that because I don't believe in compelled speech. Now, the compelled speech argument is a reasonable argument. The anti-trans people argument, I think, is a much less good argument.
Sure.
Obviously, I'm close to a free speech absolutist. I absolutely don't want to enforce. I think that you shouldn't go to jail. You should probably get fired, but you shouldn't go to jail if you're calling your students the N-word. If you're calling your students, any number of absolutely disgusting things. I don't think that simply saying something to someone is a reason to go to jail. Unless it is long-term targeted harassment and there's reason to believe that there's an effect on people's grades. That's the only sense in which I'd be willing to put someone to jail. Absolutely should be fired, but you shouldn't be going to jail. And so he thought that the people would go to jail. So I get that. However, then he decided to go on, podcasts like Joe Rogan that have literally millions of viewers, go to places like Tucker Carlson, go to these giant conservative, I shouldn't really say Joe is a conservative, but these giant firebrands in media and speak to millions of people. And then just like ask questions that in academia would be perfectly reasonable, but when you're talking to a broad audience are probably not reasonable. So an example is like when he was talking to Brett Weinstein and Jordan Peterson. Brett Weinstein is another, I shouldn't really say conservative, but another professor who's in a sort of a similar world. And they sat down and they asked, well, what are the benefits to the Holocaust? Which is a perfectly valid question,
right?
Void of context.
Yeah.
If you're asking, like, what are the benefits of the Mongols taking over all of Asia? Right. Well, there were real benefits. Of course, there were real benefits of that. It's also true that they raped and pillaged and destroyed, giant communities, and that literally Genghis Khan himself is, we can trace back something like a third of Asia to his lineage, and it's not through consent, right? Like he raped everyone all the time, men, women, children, everyone, right? And so like in 1,000 years, asking the question, what was the benefit of the Holocaust, is a perfectly reasonable thing to ask, right? Because I'm sure that there were benefits to the Holocaust. However, when you're talking to millions of people in the context that Jordan and Brett were, I think it's irresponsible to act as though you're just talking to Jordan or that you're just talking to Brett. That conversation would be perfectly reasonable to have if they were just talking alone to each other. But when you're talking in front of millions, you can't have that conversation. So my argument would be that it's bad faith to have a good faith dialogue with Brett, but a good faith dialogue with Brett that negates the fact that millions of people are listening to that conversation.
I don't know. I guess it would be.
But see, that sounds crazy.
Yeah.
What we just said is that it's bad faith to have a real conversation with a real person who's really sitting in front of you, and that you have an obligation somehow to lie and say something along the lines of like, there were no good things because of the Holocaust, which is markedly untrue.
Yeah. I don't know. I think it needs context, and I think you just have to do it responsibly. Because I think if you're going to ask that question, you have to preface it with all of the bad things that happened, and you have to preface it with all of the facts of the Holocaust. And then you have to show a parallel to something like the Genghis Khan thing or something similar proportion. And then I think you can ask it and be like, with this context, is there any benefit? And I'd like people talking right now about the coronavirus. Is there a benefit to coronavirus? And I think there could be, and I think there are a lot of bad things, right?
Namely 420,000 people dead. Yeah.
Right. But I think you have to say that.
Interesting.
And I think it's also because I think if you're lying like that, you're doing a disservice to the people who are listening to, who like maybe came for like a stimulating a conversation about maybe risque topics or whatever, right? You kind of, I just think you need the proper preface.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Do you? So here's an example. You're suggesting a preface. I think it can potentially be an addendum.
Or either or. I don't.
Well, so I think that there is a difference because a preface suggests that you're hedging it. You're ensuring that every single person who hears your position first hears that preface. First hears,
Right.
like if you're talking about obviously people are going to clip you out of context. So there's going to be a TikTok of you saying something crazy that sounds crazy out of context. Sure. But like the people who are genuinely listening to the podcast, right, will hear the context before you say it. But I've done things before, I think on the show, where I've said to people, like, we must maximally exploit the poor.
Right.
Right. And I've said that deadpan, not as a joke, as a thing that I genuinely believe. And on the surface, that sounds insane. On the surface, that sounds disgusting. The reason that I'm saying it is because I want to maximally exploit the poor. Therefore, they need to be maximally educated so that they can ensure that they have the best job so that I can get more money from them. I need to ensure that they're better educated so that I can therefore, get them to make me more cool inventions so that I can have cool shit. I like this fact that I have this, nice computer in front of me. I want to have more computers like this exist. Therefore, I want them to have, computer science education. I want them to have a background in like mathematics. I want them to have a background in like engineering, all of that shit. I want them to be able to understand all that stuff. I want them to ensure like that there's healthcare for poor people and therefore that they won't die early because it's much more difficult to replace a human than to recycle a human and to ensure that they're going to be able to I'm obviously framing this in a context that is more spicy than it needs to be.
Right.
But the spiciness there, I think, is doing some value. The spiciness there is also like building in. Number one, I think more people are willing to listen to a guy who says we must maximally exploit the poor, and that's why I support universal health care, than the guy who says, I think that universal health care is more affordable because we're going to be able to take advantage of economies of scale, and that economies of scale will therefore blah, 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 blah. Right. So like there is a benefit to that, particularly when you're talking in a public setting where people get to choose whether or not they're going to listen to you. And maybe I'm like not giving enough credit to people who are doing that in a different way than I am. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can do either or. I think you can either preface what you're going to say with context, or you can give it after. I think and I think it also depends on what you're saying. Like, I don't think you could say the Holocaust thing without a preface, but whereas I think you can say the poor people thing without a preface, so long as you clarify. I think it has to deal with talking about the topic with respect, and also respecting your audience, because I think you could get a lot of people upset.
Interesting.
By listening to what you're saying.
Interesting. Well, but that's sort of the point, right? You want to upset people.
Yeah.
The point is to upset them.
No, but I'm saying you don't want to get them upset so that they like leave and are upset about this thing. And like maybe are upset about you for saying that thing. Whereas I think if you have like kind of like, if you're saying like we need to exploit the poor, is that like, what does that mean? Like how does that work? And you kind of maybe you say I mean, of course you would say what you mean.
Interesting.
If you're talking about that.
Okay, so here's another example. I'm curious if you are opposed to me saying this. I've said this before. I think that every year the United States government should round up and ruthlessly murder 12 innocent civilians overseas. That's a thing that I unironically believe. Okay. Is it acceptable to say that something like that? Should I be saying something like that? I'll get to like the reason that I say it in a little bit, but like in the abstract, is that a thing that people should say? I'm explicitly calling for the murder
of 12
of
people
12 innocent civilians
around
who have
the
done
country.
nothing wrong at all and aren't even Americans. Should I be doing that?
I think you need to say why.
Okay, so my reason is that right now we're killing a lot more. My reason is that right now the government murders ballpark 1,000 innocent civilians every year as sort of the backdrop to our foreign conflicts. Right.
Okay.
We're talking about drone strikes that are killing people who we want to kill, but also there are people who are, caught in the crossfires. And there are, literally thousands of people who have died due to the actions of the US military overseas. And I think that that's a problem, and therefore I want to murder fewer. But I also think that there's, some degree of like space, because we do need to have a military. We do need to have like some amount of like, there's an open question of like how much should we, make space for the military to do its job, and to ensure that our trade deals are that people follow our trade deals, that people are ensuring, the stability of our economic system. And therefore, I think that there's some number of casualties that I'm willing to accept. And so my number is 12. Right now it's at 1,000. I want to murder 12. What's your number? And the important thing there is the what's your number, right? Because when I say something like, I want to murder 12 innocent civilians overseas, the immediate reaction of any like sane person has to be, Jonah, what the fuck? You're crazy, right? Like that's an insane thing to say. No one should be saying that. That's terrible. And then I ask, so how many do you want to kill? And the immediate response of any normal person is 0. And I say, no, that's silly. You can't do 0. But now what I've done is I've framed the conversation about a nonviolent framework for foreign policy. Previously, it was a question of John Bolton thinks this one thing and Jonah Dubin thinks this other thing. And John Bolton has a lot more experience in foreign policy than Jonah does. And therefore, like, these are, two reasonable conversations. If you're thinking of like a Dave Pakman has talked about foreign policy. He's a left-wing commentator. He's like a smart guy. And obviously wouldn't say something nearly as vitriolic and gross as I just said, right? But he would have that framework with someone who's like pro foreign war. And he would say something along the lines of, I'm worried about the implications to terrorism when we encourage, when we leave space for terrorist insurgencies based on the hatred of the United States. That hatred is built when we continue to bomb, civilians. And I worry about the effects of the Gaza Strip. I worry about the effects of Syrian refugee crisis. I worry about blah, 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 right? He would frame this in the context of, I'm having an intellectual discussion with a fellow intellectual. Yeah. What I've just done by saying I want to murder 12 innocent civilians overseas is framed it in the context of Jonah is fucking crazy and you have to argue against Jonah. You have there's a moral obligation to argue against what I just said. Right. And from a specific vantage point against what I said. Yeah. And so now I'm forcing the other person to take the framework that I actually want them to take. So it does a great deal of utility for the obvious, like, broader statement that I'm making, which is I want to have a difference in our foreign policy, and I want to encourage less people to die in our foreign policy. But I've said it in a way that makes me sound like the extremist until you actually unravel what I'm saying. Right.
So you're asking, should you be saying that?
Should I say that?
Yeah, I don't think you have. I think you can.
So I'm literally you're literally okay with me like calling for murder, but you're not okay with Brett Weinstein and Jordan Peterson saying that maybe there were benefits to the Holocaust. I'm explicitly, they're not calling for another Holocaust. They're just saying that the Holocaust wasn't in the abstract potentially beneficial.
I think it also depends on the audience, because the audience is a key factor in this discussion. And I think credibility is another thing. If you have like you, Jonah Dubin, who we know is crazy, and we have a small audience, we know that they're going to be listening to this podcast. If they like care about this thing, they're going to listen to you, and they're going to listen to you. Like, they're going to hear you all the way through. Whereas if you have like two important people and they're like college professors and they're like heads of security or whatever, and they're having this conversation about like if there were benefits to the Holocaust, then I think you have more of a responsibility to your audience to um, clarify what you're saying. Because like the other reason you're saying these like spicy things or having like catchphrases, not like catchphrases, but like getting things to grab your attention is because you need it. You need to start these arguments with people. You need people to understand where you're coming from better, and you need people. You need a way for people to connect and to listen to you. Whereas these people don't need that. Like they have the audience, they have the newspaper articles, they have the op-eds in New York Times, they have their platform.
I'm not sure that's right. I think that they actually need it more than I do. There's no, like, neither of this isn't our job. This is not my job. This is not your job. It's not like we're making a living off of this. It's not like we're trying to provide for a family through this. It's not like if we're talking about like a Brett Weinstein, his job, his wife's job, they have like employees that their job is to do a podcast. That's their job. They make a living off of that, right?
Yeah.
If they can't make it in that, they might be screwed economically. And I don't know if Brett has kids, but like, there are real life consequences for him saying something that doesn't get an audience. Whereas if I don't have an audience, like we don't have an audience right now, we have some audience, but we don't have like a giant audience that would be able to provide us a living right now. I'm okay, right? You're okay.
Yeah,
but they don't need it in the same way.
But they have an audience already, so I think they have. I think if we had a bigger audience, we had a more of a responsibility to contextualize what we say. I don't think you would.
I just feel like,
but I think you still would have that responsibility too, or should.
Yeah, I just feel like that framing it in that way sort of just gives us more leeway than I think we deserve. Like, here's the concern that I would have is when we're talking about us in this situation,
okay,
we're able to say, oh, like, it doesn't matter what we say. It's okay. Don't worry about it, what we say, because no one's really listening. It's not that big of a podcast. It doesn't really matter. But later, when we become big, hypothetically, hopefully, whatever, like and subscribe, if we become a giant podcast, all of a sudden now it doesn't matter what we say in that momentary short clip, because now we know that people will watch the whole thing. Some number of people will watch the whole thing, and therefore we'll be able to like build that up. And also like the importance of us saying it now, it's important because we need to build up our audience. Right. And the importance of them saying it then, once they're giant, is to say it because if they fail to do so, they will no longer be able to pay for their employees, and their employees rely on them for an income. Because they have to say it because if they don't do it, they won't be able to provide for their families, and therefore their families won't be able to go to college. Right. They have to say blah, 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 blah. There's never not a reason for you to try to do what's best for your sort of career and sort of advancing the ability to get other people to listen to you. That's always going to be a thing that you can make an argument to do.
Yeah. But like, I don't know. I don't think it's going to hurt your platform to give preface for an out there opinion.
I think it would.
Or a discussion.
I think it would. I mean, let's compare Trump with Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz has basically the same political like positions as does Trump. But going into the 2016 primary, Ted Cruz was a hell of a lot better known in the political world, and was also a hell of a lot more respected. He was an actual sitting senator, and Trump is just this random dude who has a television show. Right. So when Ted Cruz says something like, we need more border security, that does not get nearly the attention that Trump gets when Trump says, and we're talking about the presidency, we're talking about the highest level of politics in the world. And the reason Trump became president is largely because he was saying, when Mexico gives us their people, they're not sending us their best. Right. When, saying all of this totally out there crazy shit. And that's the reason he became president.
Yeah.
And like, I obviously disagree with Trump, but I don't necessarily disagree with that as a tactic, because if you genuinely believe that like yours are the correct positions, that you would be, a good president, You should be saying that kind of shit. Of course you should be saying that kind of shit. Crazy stuff, because if that's the way you got to get elected, it's more important to get elected and be able to implement the actual positions than to like have the moral high ground of like saying nice things about Heidi Cruz. Heidi Cruz is Ted Cruz's wife, for context. And Trump made fun of her and called her like a disgusting pig or some shit. Yeah.
So what do you propose?
I think that saying out there things shouldn't be something that we are happy about or sad about. I think that we should look at all crazy things said in the lens of what are the implications to the real world. I think that we should look at language, the utilization of language, not as an act in and of itself, but a means towards the action. And the action is the actual like policy that is implemented.
Right.
But that there are consequences of that, right? Because it does suggest that like I can say disgusting, fallacious things about people. And so long as they don't lose their job because of it, so long as they don't kill themselves because of it, so long as they don't blah, 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 it's totally fine. Which like, I'm not sure if I'm comfortable with that. I don't feel like I should be comfortable with it. It's weird.
Yeah, no, it is. I don't have an answer. All right. But I think that's it for this one because we went really long.
We did go super long on this one.
Yeah.
Like and subscribe. We adore you. Thank you for watching the whole episode. You're beautiful. And I'm a big fan of having two Jonahs. I think we should have two Houstons. I encourage the existence of two Houstons because one Houston is simply not enough Houston. Houston, you're beautiful. Like, subscribe. Au revoir.